From Studio One at Podcast Detroit, welcome to your Daily Detroit, recorded on Thursday, June 6, 2019. I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. Today, we're running down a couple big stories from the auto industry. Fiat Chrysler's withdrawal of its proposal to merge with Renault, plus what the proposed tariffs on all imported goods from Mexico would mean for the auto industry. I speak with Kristin Dziczek, Vice President of the Center for Automotive Research. That's coming up after we pay some bills.
Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by Repurpose. That's where you can hire top tech talent in Detroit faster. Download their free startup salary report at repurpose.co. And of course, we'll have a link in the show notes. Thanks also to Milo for their support of the Daily Detroit podcast. Milo is a marketing agency that produces amazing experiences for audiences. They partner with their clients to drive business and create innovative content. Do cool stuff with them at milo.agency.
As we mentioned, Fiat Chrysler is withdrawing its $35 billion proposal to merge with French automaker Renault. The move comes just 10 days after FCA first announced the proposal. It follows the Renault board's failure to reach a decision on the proposal after it cited the French government's request to postpone a vote. The Wall Street Journal also reported that Nissan's two representatives on the Renault board also objected.
If you're wondering what the French government and Nissan have to do with all of this, well, Renault owns a big chunk of Nissan, and the French government owns a 15% stake in Renault.
Fiat Chrysler's board met Wednesday evening and voted to withdraw its proposal with immediate effect, saying, although it remains convinced of the compelling rationale for the merger, quote, "It has become clear that the political conditions in France do not currently exist for such a combination to proceed successfully."
Separately, President Trump said he may levy tariffs on all imported goods from Mexico starting Monday because of the surge in illegal immigration across the southern border. It's a move that has huge ramifications for the auto industry and consumers. Sven talked with Kristin Dziczek of the Center for Automotive Research for more perspective. Here's that conversation.
Fiat Chrysler has been trying unsuccessfully for years now to try and find a merger partner, going back to their late CEO, Sergio Marchionne. Remind us, Kristin, why is Fiat Chrysler so eager to find a merger partner?
Well, Fiat Chrysler is, the smallest of the Detroit three automakers and one of the smaller automakers in general. And they're looking to tie up with another automaker to help share some of the costs that they're going through for developing vehicle programs and especially for new technologies like electrification and automation. Those are big, giant bets being made by the biggest car companies. And in order to compete with that, you need a lot of vehicle volume to share that R&D cost to spread it across. And Fiat Chrysler just doesn't have that kind of volume right now globally. But if they, marry up with someone, they can share those big risky investments and have lower cost per unit. But to compete in this world, you've got to be on the forefront of both of those technologies.
Given the complexity of the ownership of the Renault Group, considering its involvement with the French government, its alliance with Nissan and Mitsubishi, was this any surprise that this merger proposal didn't work out?
It was a friendly proposal to the Renault board. So Renault had been engaged in this and was welcoming to the proposal, but it was going to be a complicated deal even if the board did approve it. You mentioned the French government, the Italian government wanted to have a hand in this as well. Of course, there's Renault is part of an alliance with Nissan and Mitsubishi, and those two partners, as well as the Japanese government, might want to get engaged in this as well. And even when we turn here to the Fiat Chrysler US, they're considered a foreign company by the current administration, and that might engage the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, which is a review committee headed by the Treasury that looks at any kind of investments in the United States and whether they compromise U.S. national security. The administration has already declared that automated vehicle and electrification technologies are critical to national security in the proclamation the president just put out a few weeks ago. And so we would expect that even if they did move forward, a tie-up that was involved in sharing those technology development costs might trigger a Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S. review as well.
Interesting. How big of a setback is this for Fiat Chrysler? And, looking out there, are there any other, candidates that might make better sense as a merger partner for them?
There's a lot of candidates that make some sense for them. And, we, internally here in the office, we sometimes say, well, it could be like the biggest refrigerator maker in China or something, somebody who's got enough money and wants to get into making vehicles in the U.S. or having a U.S.-European footprint. So, there's technology companies that are, have a little toehold into the auto industry, something like Apple and Google. And of course, Google Waymo is working with FCA on using their vehicles as a basis for their automated vehicle testing. The Pacifica is pretty good for that. Hyundai Kia was thought about as a potential partner as well. Hyundai Kia, of course, is very strong in cars and sedans and small CUVs, and FCA here in North America is a truck and big SUV company. So there is some logic to that footprint. Mazda, which is tied up with Ford at one point, also doesn't have any U.S. bases and doesn't have any trucks. So the allure of the truck, the Rams, and Jeep's brand are very prime brands and prizes for automakers who might want to tie up with FCA. And FCA is in a much stronger position now than it was, even just a few years ago when Mr. Marchione was looking to marry up with GM or any other companies. They've grown their market share to 14% of the U.S. market. They're doing quite a bit better than they were. So, they're a little bit more attractive, and they've got great manufacturing knowledge that some of the new entrants to the automotive industry, it takes a while to learn what this industry has built up over 100 years, as Tesla has learned.
Yes. All right, let's switch topics a little bit and talk about one of the other big issues looming over the auto industry, and that's the potential tariffs set to go in place next week against all goods imported from Mexico. We know that there are a lot of cars and car parts that the U.S. automakers and, frankly, a lot of automakers build in Mexico and get sold here in the United States. So what would these tariffs mean specifically for the auto industry?
It's not just that we get cheap parts from Mexico and put them in cars here in the U.S., or that we get vehicles from Mexico that get sold in the U.S. About 15% of sales in the U.S. last year were vehicles made in Mexico, and they're made by every automaker, just about, not just a Detroit 3 issue. Nissan and General Motors, go back and forth as the top auto manufacturer in Mexico. But about 37% of our parts imports from the whole entire world come from Mexico, and 37% of our parts exports to the rest of the world go to Mexico. And some things cross the border multiple times as they're built up into systems and components that then eventually get put into a car. Every automaker in the whole wide world uses low-cost content, and we have Mexico right next door, and that means that there is some U.S. content in just about everything that's coming to us from Mexico. But everybody uses a Mexico, and it might be called Poland or Slovakia or China or Thailand. We use those too, but when we use a low-cost content provider somewhere offshore, there's very little chance that there's any U.S. content in those parts or components. So if they impose this 5% tariff, we see an immediate increase in prices for vehicles made in the U.S. going up about $250 each, and for some vehicles that's the entire margin. That's very small, and vehicles made in Mexico going up about $1,100 at 5%. When we ratchet up to 25%, the vehicle made in the U.S. Price increase is $1,100, and the vehicle made in Mexico would go up $5,400. And that corresponds to about $34 billion less in GDP and about 400,000 U.S. jobs lost. It's pretty big. And Mexico and China, which we also have 25% tariffs on all auto parts coming from China, are the source of a lot of the consumables that you use to repair and maintain your vehicle. So windshield wipers and air filters and oil filters and spark plugs and, water pumps and little motors and things that might wear out in your car. If you go to the Napa Auto Parts store, you're going to find, your headlights and all that kind of stuff are largely made in China or Mexico. These are very low value added parts, commodities almost. So we do see a lot of that coming from these low cost countries as well. So just keeping your own car, if you're not in the market for a new car, keeping your own car and maintaining it and repairing it is going to cost more when we have 25% tariffs.
So pretty big stakes for the auto companies and consumers alike.
Right. And suppliers are really in a jam here because, suppliers don't have a lot of pricing power with their customers. A lot of them are, smaller suppliers. And so they can't say, hey, GM, my inputs are now costing 25% more. So you have to pay me 25% more for this part. So suppliers are really in a jam. They've got much smaller margins, and they're going to be facing much higher input prices from these tariffs. And there's just not, there's not enough capacity to sell back overnight, or in 2 weeks. And there's also a whole bunch of things that not only do we not make, but maybe we don't want to make. The wire harness is one that's the quintessential part from Mexico. It's a bundle of wires that's held together with tape, very manual process. And then somebody puts little connectors on the end of it. It's basically the veins of your car. It gets threaded through and connected to everything electric in your car. And we could not afford to make those in the U.S. paying wages that people in the U.S. want to be paid. It's not an easily automated process. And, the other sources we get those from are in Central and South America and cheap places in Asia. So if we're not going to get it from Mexico, we're going to get it from some other low-cost country. And, I just don't see policies that change, in 2 weeks are not giving anybody enough time to reshore and react. And with an industry that had overcapacity as an issue as recently as 10 years ago, we went through a lot of pain of closing plants, and adjusting to having too much capacity in North America. This is an industry that does not want to get in that overcapacity situation again and have duplicate capacity just to work with these ever-changing trade policies. And the last thing I want to say about it, though, is the more time, money, and effort is spent on moving your supply chain around and trying to figure out how to adjust to this ever-changing trade environment, the less money that's being invested in people and plants and products and innovation that will make this industry more competitive. So, this is just dead weight loss. It's just like, we're spending a lot of money chasing our tail and playing whack-a-mole and not putting that money back into the business.
Kristin Dziczek is Vice President at the Center for Automotive Research in Ann Arbor. Kristin, thanks so much for coming on Daily Detroit.
You're very welcome.
And we're done for today. A little programming note, we'll have an update edition episode for you tomorrow, plus a conversation about Oak Park in your podcast feed over the weekend.
Sven, we're making all the podcasts.
So many podcasts.
So many podcasts. And you know who helps make so many podcasts? Cheyenne Nocerini and Randy Walker behind the scenes. Bob and Dave from Podcast Detroit always thank you for your support. Nuri Gojai, our spirits advisor, and our Patreons. You can become one of them at patreon.com/Daily Detroit.
With that, I'm Sven Gustafson. Thanks so much for listening.
And I'm Jairus Days. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.